So I entitled this presentation, Looking for a Better Way of Life. So looking for a better way of life than they could find in Ireland, the Mulligans came to Clinton. They never knew the impact they would have on the culture of the community around them or how their story would be shared for generations to come, as we are here today. The Red Mill Museum Village serves as a home for the Mulligan history as we preserve the quarry operation and share the stories of the family that built a small empire and the workers that helped them achieve these goals. Many of us enjoy learning about history, no matter where we go. I know when I travel, I find places very similar to the Red Mill and try to learn a little bit about that history. And we're always intrigued by the stories of the people and how they impacted the community. But I believe there's a real relevance and a real connection that we all want to delve deeper into, and how that story impacts us individually. And I think that's where the Mulligan story really has its place. So here at the Red Mill, many of you know we're undergoing the restoration of our Mulligan tenant house. And the restoration is very important to us because it's going to serve as the vehicle to better tell the story of the Mulligans and other immigrants who came to America looking for a better way of life. Our history is important, not just for the understanding it gives us of who we are, but it can be used to start conversations and open discussions on current topics as well. So while Irish immigration is most readily linked to the potato famine, the Mulligans, oddly enough, came before that famine. Everybody thought that that's the reason they came here. But Francis Mulligan arrived alone at 19 years of age in 1837. And he first arrived in New York and made his way to Monmouth County and then Trenton, which was a popular place for Irish, and then out to Pennsylvania. In 1840, he made his way back to Clinton, and presumably he came back here to meet with his younger brother, Patrick, who was looking for work, and both of them found their place here in Clinton. Interestingly, the Mulligans were consistently bucking trends. And like I said, they came before the Great Potato Famine. And most of the immigrants who came before the Great Potato Famine were actually Protestants looking for a better way of life. And it was typically actually the females because they were more readily to find work as in homes and domestic work, and they would send the money back to Ireland. So this was rather odd that Francis would come over as a young single Catholic individual and make his way here. So definitely bucking the trends. So once the famine started, though, America saw over 500,000 Irish in the first 2 years, eventually seeing 1.5 million coming in total. And where this story has some parallels to the discussions that we have today is the Irish were discriminated against, and they typically moved to areas where they could live together, both for the community aspect and also the feeling of preserving their own culture, in most instances, their Catholic religion at this point. So Jersey City, Newark, and Trenton were large population centers because of availability of housing and jobs. And where they chose to live were called Irish towns. So Clinton doesn't seem like an obvious choice, but it too had an Irish town, and it's on Halsted Street. So on December 10th, 1845, Francis Mulligan purchased lot number 28 to create a place to call home. Francis paid $100 cash for the lot of the land, and by July 1846, he constructed a small 3-family house and sold 1/3 to his brother Patrick, 1/3 to an older brother Terence, who also arrived from Ireland, and Francis took the other third, and each brother paid $100 for their portion of the house. The house still stands, and now when I go through the photos towards the end, I'll show you what it looks like now, but it's still here, and there is a sign demarcating.
No, I turned off our video.
Put in by the Friendly Sons. I throw a little bit of my green shirt. I too am a member of the Friendly Sons. So Patrick received the middle portion, which included 1/3 of the cellar and the attic. Terence, the northern portion, which would be heading north on 31. And Francis resided in the southern portion. So this would be the first of many land holdings for the Mulligans. Francis and Patrick were shrewd and they saved their money, knowing there'd be opportunities for them. So they purchased a small 1/4-acre lot adjoining the Red Mill for $150. Within a year, they sold that to the newest mill owner, John Steiger, for $450. So they turned their investment of $150 quickly, turned a profit of $300, and they saved that money and put it away. And 2 years later, in 1847, the mill and the quarry land had fallen into bankruptcy, and they were with the Easton Bank. And the Easton Bank auctioned off the properties in 2 separate lots. So Steiger maintained ownership of the mill, and the Mulligans bought the quarry property at auction. So they paid $600 for that, and they put $100 down, and they had a $500 mortgage. And the $300 they made on the profit gave them $100 to put down and some starting capital for their quarry, and they made their mortgage payments. So in 1848, in addition to starting their quarry was a banner year because Francis was granted citizenship finally, and his wife and family came from Ireland to join him in the Halstead Street home. Patrick also received citizenship and married, and now the 3 units were full of Mulligan families, not just the 3 brothers. Terence eventually joined the quarry business too, but it appears that he purchased ownership after the mortgage was paid. Maybe a smart move. While the 3 families' house was full, the oldest Mulligan, James, was yet to arrive in Clinton. Now, this is a different James than was the last owner of the quarry. So there's actually 2 generations of Mulligans that you'll hear about. So James is this oldest brother. James arrived in America in 1848 at age 43 to escape the potato famine. He arrived alone and left behind his wife and 5 children. He listed his occupation as a carpenter. He found employment, of course, with his brothers here in the quarry, and 2 years later, his wife and children joined him. They lived in a house owned by one of the other Mulligan brothers, most likely Francis. He seemed to purchase up property along the road next to the 3-family house that's on Halstead now. And we can't identify which lot that was, but it took nearly 10 years for James to save enough, since he came here with a full family and was purchasing a home and didn't have that opportunity of his younger brothers to tuck money away before having a family. So the influx of Irish that came to Clinton because of the potato famine were very faithful to the Catholic religion. This is one of the many marks that the Mulligans left here in Clinton and Hunterdon County. So many believe that the famine was God's reaction to many years of ignoring their faith, and they returned looking to find favor. The importance of religion did not diminish once they came to America. One of the most significant impacts the Mulligans and Irish had on Clinton was the establishment of the Catholic Church. Francis Mulligan used his own barn as a makeshift sanctuary, and traveling priests would serve as available and stay with the Mulligans. Often the Mulligans themselves would perform services if a priest wasn't available. With the growth of Irish laborers on the railroads in Hampton and Highbridge, the Diocese of Newark created the first parishes there. However, with a push from the Mulligans, St. Mary's was eventually constructed in 1864 on Halstead Street, and a priest from Hampton would serve both parishes. The church was built on the same site as the Mulligan properties, and the foundation is still there. When I go back to the pictures, I'll show you some of I took pictures yesterday with leaves. Unfortunately, you don't see the foundation as well, but it is there. And by 1947, St. Mary's was assigned its own pastor and served into the late, when the land where now is Immaculate Conception was purchased, and another barn served as the church yet again until 1996, until the current church that we all know is there. So I spoke of traveling priests, and the presence of the Irish and their faith had significant impacts, not just on Clinton, but throughout all of New Jersey. In 1855, there were 40,000 Catholics in the state of New Jersey, served by 35 priests. By 1872, there were 170,000 Catholics, 117 churches, and 62 priests, and a new seminary called Seton Hall College. In 1880, there were 184 priests and 142 churches in New Jersey. So this is just the start of the Mulligan legacy in Clinton. Francis, Pat, and Terence had all arrived with nearly nothing and now owned a successful quarry operation and a significant number of lots along Halstead Street. Oddly, in 1855, the 3 sold the quarry and all their Halstead Street holdings to James Huffman, a successful merchant here in Clinton. We don't have any records as to the sale of that property, and we're not really sure why they sold it. And the brothers kind of disappeared after that. So Patrick is the only one that we found some census records for that we have in our collection here. And he moved to Iowa and lived to be age 70, presumably operating a farm out there. Interestingly enough, with this move to Iowa and the other brothers presumably moved west, we do have, and I think this came from the Allie McGarren collection, a note from an early Irish immigrant who had successfully integrated into America, and he was giving advice to new arrivals. So again, kind of an interesting story today. You see a lot of different cultures come and share their experiences and try to help each other out. So he shared that that the Irish should come and find work in the cities where it was accessible, but often poorly paid, and the conditions were not very good. Save some money and move to the rural parts of New Jersey, presumably Clinton, and learn some skills such as fence building and continue to save money. Then they were told to go on to Pennsylvania to continue to learn agricultural skills. Often some got sidetracked and worked in the coal mines, and we've heard all those stories. But the end goal was to eventually save enough money to move to Ohio and operate your own farm with all the skills that you learned along the way. So my joke is maybe New Jersey has been an Exodus state since the mid-1840s. But it is interesting to share and see this handwritten out. So the quarry was quickly sold from Huffman to George Gulick, who those of us who spend a lot of time here are familiar with the name and Gulick's ownership. And Gulick was also a merchant, but he listed himself as a lime burner, which is essentially a quarry operator, although he didn't really operate the quarry. He was also a livestock dealer and owned Gulick's Hotel, now known as the Clinton House. So while the three brothers who owned the property prospered and left, that oldest brother, James, who came in late and struggled to save money and make it, he remained back in Clinton. And so the conjecture is there might have been some sort of family rift that prompted this change. And we're not sure. Again, we don't have documentation of what all happened, but we know the three that started left and James was left behind. And somehow he had $1,000 to strike a deal with George Gulick to start to rent the quarry. And so the early records of James' management doesn't really exist. He was essentially, from what we could tell, almost illiterate, and so the records were difficult to see or track. And then by 1858, records do show up, but they're very poorly kept. And the only thing we can tell is that we don't ever think there was any significant gap in quarry operations. So somehow James was able to slip in and keep the operation going, but now he was renting the property that his brothers had once owned. And this is sort of where the next generation starts to materialize. So James's wife, Catherine, was also born in Mulligan, but presumably not the same clan, of course, in Ireland. And upon renting the quarry, her two brothers then arrived from Trenton, where they had been since 1853. So William and Patrick, which makes it interesting. And I, Elizabeth, if she were here, would tell you how frustrating to have two Patrick Mulligans, not technically of the same family, but now interwoven through marriage, trying to keep those records has been a little crazy. So they worked as laborers in the quarry for their brother-in-law, James, and eventually their nephews, which would be James's children. So operating the quarries would finally gave James the ability to accumulate enough wealth to purchase his own home, which was also on Halstead Street. He paid $365 for his house in 1857. And this home was mortgaged for $200 2 years later. And so it was either for business purposes or another conjecture is a wedding for his daughter, which was a grand spend for somebody who was thrifty and trying to save with their business throughout the history of his operations. So James's daughter, Bridget, would marry Thomas McGinnis, and he was a laborer, but not in the quarry. And he was illiterate, which caused much upsetment among the Mulligans, as Bridget and her brothers had grown up in Clinton, and they attended local schools, and they could all read, write, and were very proficient in math. So this disapproval is evident in the fact that Thomas did not work in the Mulligan quarry until 6 years after James had finally passed, and 9 years into their marriage with Bridget. They did, however, also purchase a home on Halstead Street, and they joined many more Irish, such as Michael Gooley, an Irish blacksmith, Thomas Kinney, Patrick McGann, and Eugene McLaughlin, who are all laborers here in the quarry, probably sometimes in the mill and also out on the farms in the surrounding area. But again, all Irish living on Halstead Street together in Irishtown. James's business continued to grow and prosper, known as J. Mulligan and Company. So the spelling of the names had not been standardized at that point. However, much of the transactions were bartered and business records were spotty at best. There's no record of James ever actually even paying himself from the company. So many of the workers that occasionally show up in the business records cannot be found on the census records. And most Irish that did show up on the census were employed by the quarry as laborers, some line burners, and we found one rock blaster, which we assume was putting the dynamite in. So he had the coolest job, if you will. Yes. So as the business prospered, James built what is now the tenant house that we were talking about before on the Red Mill Museum.
Hey, Big Claw.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Are we allowed to interrupt at any point and ask a question?
Sure.
On that, the blacksmith you just mentioned, was he in town or was he at the mill?
Gooley, I believe, was in town.
Okay.
I'd have to go through the records of who. I don't know if we have the names of the blacksmiths that worked on the grounds here at the Red Mill. We have Gooley. There was a Gulick who was, I'm not sure if he was related to the George Gulick who owned the quarry, but he was also a blacksmith. I know he was in town also.
Yeah, I think his house is over by the Agway. It's in that white, it's in that like gray house in the back. Yeah. All right. Okay, sorry about that.
No problem.
Hey, we can't ask like while you're doing it, or are we supposed to wait till the end?
Ask what?
Questions while you're doing it, or wait till the end?
No, you can ask questions, sure.
All right. Thanks, man.
Okay. Turn the mag. So yeah, feel free to jump in. I'm fine with answering questions. Okay. Yeah, interactive.
Who's that?
Sarge.
Oh.
Yes.
Yeah. Am I going to get your marriage, man?
Is Dana there too?
Is Dana with you?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, Dana.
Everybody says hello. Here we go, the informal presentation. So as the business prospered, James built what is now the tenant house. It was originally constructed as two separate houses and as cheaply as possible. So we don't have many records on this. We do show some records to Eli Bosenberry, but it's unlikely that they would have been for the tenant house. We believe that this was for construction of St. Mary's Church. And at the same time, James most likely constructed at least one new lime kiln, bringing his lime kilns to a total of 3. So the tenant house, if for those, and we're going to interpret it this way, is actually 2 separate houses. The connector, we call the hyphen at this point, was built by some of the Irish immigrants that were living there, which has been interesting as we start to tear it apart and rebuild it. The construction and the quality of that entire house is questionable at best. And what I find interesting and exciting about it is there's no real other example of where laborers would have lived and what their family life would have been like, short of the tenement museum. And that house, 1, because of the quality of it, and 2, because of its location. If this wasn't a museum, I'm sure it would have been torn down and we would have had Hunts Mills condominiums with a beautiful view of the Raritan River. So it's amazing that we have it. The foundation is essentially scrap limestone that was taken from the quarry. Again, it was constructed as 2 homes. That hyphen, the floor to this day sags, and we thought when we were restoring it that the soffits were actually cut off at some point because they were rotted, but the house was built that way. Somebody took A-frames and just set them on top of the roof, the sidewalls. So it's interesting construction, and we're preserving that and respecting the way it was built to this day as we're starting that restoration. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end also as part of our updates. So most don't realize that the Mulligans weren't the only quarry in Clinton. Who knew that? How many quarries do you think we had here in Clinton at one point? So there were 3 total quarries, and they were all on this property. So when you drive into the Red Mill, and if you look on your Google, if you're using your maps in your car or something, it still says Quarry Road to this day. And then when you look up census records, there were a lot of different. This is Quarry Road coming right here and runs all the way back to the to what is now the reservoir. So there were 3 quarries. There was one up front, and there's a lime kiln. You kind of see where the remnants of where it might have been, kind of where the rock washes out when you first come into the mill all the time. And it was right almost up against the Red Mill itself. There were 3 that were the Mulligans that we still have here. And then there were 2 more towards the back that I don't really see much remnants. So there's some possible foundations behind where our fence area is. And so they, John Lee was to the north. So John Lee owned the 2 that were north of the fence, and John Young was to the south, who also had 2 lime kilns. So 2 quarries had 2, the Mulligans had 3, and they all sold their lime for the same 10 cents a bushel. And we found that in an advertisement from the July 25th, 1850 edition of the Clinton Weekly Times, but we could also see the records. What I find interesting is the Mulligans sold for the same price as everybody else and sold significantly more than everybody else. And I said, so what was their competitive advantage? And I kind of say it's their Irish heritage. So a lot of people did think that it was the connections they made in the community and their culture of kind of an upbeat and connecting with the community caused people to circle around them and purchase more, even though the prices were all the same. So James died at age 57. I will say that that's according to our records. I'll share a photo later. The headstone in the cemetery here in Clinton says that he was 60 years old. So presumably his children didn't actually even know his actual age. Ours was taken from the census records. So we'll conjecture 57. He spent 14 years in America and accumulated much wealth, but he never did actually purchase the quarry. He was renting this whole time. So upon his passing, he disregarded, this is another interesting trend the Mulligans bucked, he disregarded the customary trend of leaving the majority of his estate to his oldest son. His 2 oldest sons, Patrick and James, each received lump sums of money, but the 2 youngest, Michael and Bernard, were left the family house on Halstead Street, the responsibility to care for their mother, and the bulk of the quarry business. So Patrick was regarded as hapless and moved on with no involvement in the business. He took his lump sum and moved on, and that left just 3 brothers. So the sons changed the name to J. Mulligan and Brothers. While James was not much involved in the company with Michael and Bernard running it, the reputation that it had been built as J. Mulligan because of the father, James, was still worth it and very important to them. So the quarry continued to prosper into the 1860s. And 4 years after their father's death, they purchased the quarry from George Gulick. And it was once again owned by the Mulligan family. And ownership now at that point would last 98 years. So the time of the Mulligans had a hefty mortgage. So they purchased the property for $5,950. So it was a huge difference from the $600 that Francis and Terrence, the first generation, paid just 18 years earlier. The importance of the mortgage is that the brothers now needed to get cash to pay the mortgage and could no longer barter to the extent that the company had relied upon later. So we see a significant change in the records, both in their quality and their record keeping, and also what they were actually doing and getting paid when you start to review those here at the Red Mill. So Michael found himself the sole owner of the quarry as his brother Bernard went on to the priesthood and James left the business. Michael married in 1870 to Mary Owens of Hampton. And Michael purchased the house on Center Street. He was the first to leave Halsted Street. So this is quite the move because Center Street outwardly demonstrated a move up in social status. The other big change was Center Street was the Protestant neighborhood across from the Presbyterians. So the Irish on Halsted Street were very upset, thinking that he was trying to push away from his culture. At first, some of the people on the street weren't necessarily accepting of him, but he was such a jovial individual, apparently, that he was welcomed into the community. And actually, I think I'd heard at one point that they might have even asked him to join the Presbyterian Church. I think presumably because of his wealth and stature at that point, people did like him. But within a few years, it became very obvious that his connection to his Irish heritage was still very strong. He spent a fair amount of his time on Halsted Street with his family, despite owning the house on Center Street. So at this time, the business changed its name to MC Mulligan and Company, which is what most of us know it as at this point. And the business also began to diversify from lime to survive and grow. And Michael also invested in harvesting ice from the river. If you would come to the Red Mill, we have the ice harvesting exhibit, and you can see the river would freeze. Both temperature and also changes in dams and things allowed it to freeze that it no longer does now. And then he would sell coal. So he provided the rail beds with the stone from the quarry, and then that allowed him advantageous relationships with a lot of the railways, so that he had reduced shipping, and he also bartered and made some other deals. So he undercut everybody's coal price, and probably at one point was making more money dealing coal than he was actually operating the quarry here in Clinton. So Michael Mulligan was securely part of the upper social scale in Clinton, and at this point, there were not many links to him directly to Halsted Street. His brothers Patrick and James moved out of the area. James actually tried to start his own quarry called the Beaver Brook Quarry, which is over actually around where the condominiums and development is, but that failed. And Bernard, as I had stated, became a priest after serving as the bookkeeper in the quarry for many years. So the closest link to Michael to Halsted Street was with Walter Lee and John Grandin when they constructed the town hall where it is now, but the Grandin Library, and Michael donated all of the stone for the foundations for those two buildings. So Michael and Mary had 7 children, 4 daughters, and 3 sons. So a typical Irish family, solid 7 children. However, this is kind of, I would say, where it ends. So the youngest son, Michael, went on to become a Monsignor in the Catholic Church. His sister Mary was devoted to him and became his housekeeper in the role. Margaret got married, moved to New York. Catherine remained home, but she died young of pneumonia. Sister Lillian, and some people I've given this presentation twice before actually had stories and knew about it, but Lillian apparently ran a well-known dance studio here in Clinton, eventually got married, and her husband received a much better job offer in Boston. He moved to Boston. Middle brother Bernard went on to become a lawyer, and James remained to operate the quarry until he sold it in 1964. So none of the Mulligans of this generation produced children of their own. And from the most humble beginnings as immigrants and working through the quarry and living on Halsted Street, the Mulligans produced a legacy that continues to impact Clinton to this day. I'm going to try to screen share again the photos. This shouldn't be the same as the PowerPoint. And hopefully we can get these on here. And I'll take you on some of the walking tour. So this first photo, can everybody see that photo?
Mm-mm.
No.
How's that?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, there we go. At least we got this. And actually, I don't necessarily need so. This is a house that's still on Halsted Street. It's a 3-family. It's a 3-family house, still occupied. And this is where the 3 brothers moved. Let me see if I have the sign. I'm going to go back to sharing. And so this is the Irishtown sign. So it states in the mid to late 1800s, Halsted Street was known as Irishtown because of a large community of Irish immigrants who lived here. This tight-knit Irish Catholic community was anchored by the Mulligan family, originally from Burdabet, County Cavan, Ireland. They came to this country with nothing, yet became one of the most prosperous families to live in town due to their ownership of the quarry, now known as the Red Mill property. And this first Irish home was built as 28, 30, and 32 Halsted Street by the Mulligan brothers in 1846. So I think some of you have seen the sign next to the house.
Mhm.
And behind that sign, the empty lot. And again, I appreciate you sticking with me on this because it's designed to walk through some of these properties. But this is what's behind the sign is an empty lot. And it's never been developed, but that's where actually the barn was, where the Mulligans would hold their first church services. So it's of course long been torn down, but remains as an open lot here in Clinton. I'm going to show another house moving further up the street, which I find interesting. This was actually, believe it or not, one of the Irish houses that the Mulligans bought and built. And there are two of these houses that look very similar to each other. But this one is documented that the center of this house still is the original Irish shanty, if you will. It was the shack that was in that middle section still houses some of the original walls from one of the first Irish Mulligan homes built on Halsted Street. Most of them were built in a row right there. I know there's a second house next to it that presumably is the same, but I don't have documentation that it's also part of that. And then moving further down the street, we're going to get to the cemetery. And so this is not, sorry, I apologize, not the photo I want to share. Not sure. I'll show this one. So this is further down. If you go across from the library, there's again, it looks similar to an open lot next to the cemetery, closest to the house. So that's part of the remaining foundation from St. Mary's. And if you stare at it and the leaves aren't on that property, you'll see kind of the swooped depression where the walls were. And it was a very small church. I don't think I have in the PowerPoint. That's one of the photos I do have in the PowerPoint. There's a photo of the original St. Mary's. But actually, if you go, I will share, if you go onto the Immaculate Conception website, they don't actually recognize or say honor the connection to the Mulligans to this day. But there is a picture of St. Mary's on their website. And that's where I got the photo because we did not have one here in our collection. Did you have it? Okay. Okay. Maybe it should be in our archive then at this point that we've gone through. And then this
cemetery stones. I have a question.
Yes.
It looks like they were within the foundation. No?
They're right. Yeah. Well, yes. And then actually, I don't know if I have a good enough picture. Again, I apologize. I went yesterday. I was trying to kind of capture the walk. So this is I guess the master headstone that Michael Mulligan, once he had the money, put up for his father, James. And this is the one I spoke about that denotes him as passing at age 60. So quite obviously elaborate. And then the remainder are around it. Now, there are smaller stones in front of those and much more. So this would have been, this would have been Patrick Mulligan's headstone. So, much less successful, not necessarily a contributor to the business. And there are three brothers on the front. And there's a series of headstones around there if you go, indicating different family members. I believe even Catherine is there as one of the small headstones. So we have a picture of the three. This might be give a better angle. So you can barely see the three small headstones right in front of James's large monument. And then you see the more modern headstones of the Mulligan family.